Thank you for listening to our podcast on YouTube. We are super excited about the content coming your way.
Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of it. Welcome to the Face to Face Ministries podcast. I'm Cathy Little.
And I'm Melinda Wilson, and we are talking all things inner healing, true connection with Jesus, and the full benefits package of the cross. Thank you for joining us.
We are now at episode 3.
Episode 3!
Seriously! This is so cool. I mean, who knew we had anything to say about anything, right?
I don't know about that.
No, that's not true.
Yeah.
We have too much to say,
Right,
probably.
Right.
And wow, we're so excited that you're joining us, and thanks for being here.
Yeah,
Woo-hoo!
thank you. It's going to be exciting.
Yeah, so what are we doing today?
We are getting to hear from Cathy Little.
Whoa, that's me.
Extraordinaire.
Funny.
And we get to hear your healing journey. We talked about mine last episode, and so I'm excited to share with our listeners your healing journey this time.
Yeah, well, I have one.
I know, and they need to hear it. So
Yeah.
why don't we just get started, Cathy? Why don't you dive in and let the audience in on a little bit of your healing journey?
Yeah. So I grew up in a very legalistic fundamental Baptist background. And my perception of God was really the judge on the stand, waiting to throw the gavel down. Or else he was the talent show judge, making sure I was performing and all of that. And that was just kind of my conditioning. I grew up really believing that I was the sum total of what I did, how I performed, who I hung out with, how I dressed, because everything was so legislated growing up. And I was in a Christian school for 12 years, and that culture was very shame-based. I didn't have language for that until many years later, but there was a conditioning on us that God's approval needed to be earned. His love needed to be earned. And we could just as easily lose it by screwing up. So that really gave me a warped perception of God. I didn't really understand him in relationship. I didn't understand him as a good father. I did not know it at the time, but the way I related to other people was also affected by how I saw God. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting. Because when you live in that world of performance orientation and having to measure up and earn approval and all of that, it really messes up your view of God, but it also gets you looking to people for things that you legitimately need, but you should be getting from God, but you can't get it from God because you're not able to receive it from him because you have such a warped concept and perspective of who he is. So it really messes up with your friendships. I was a poster child for codependency in friendships. I was always looking for friends to, fill that void or make me feel like I was okay or whatever. And it also really messed up my view of myself because I never felt like I could measure up. And just fast forwarding, I got out of that culture when I went to college, and for the first time I learned that there was a difference between "Thus saith the Lord" and "Hey, while you represent us as a student, we ask that you abide by these lists of regulations or boundaries or whatever because you're representing us as a school." Mm-hmm. And there's a big difference. But I grew up where the Bible was twisted into creating a rule for anything. Like, really? Like that verse that says, women shouldn't wear anything that pertains unto a man. Well, if you think about that contextually and historically, they all wore robes. I mean, come on. I mean, we would get in trouble for things like having a slit in the skirt that was too high or having a fly front in a skirt or whatever. And every time culture would change, then there'd be a new rule to combat it. And man, make you crazy because every time you'd figure it out, then the rules would change. You'd have to figure it out again. So it was exhausting. But I ended up getting married in 1993, and I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and ended up in a vineyard church. And the interesting thing is that I had started, I played piano, keyboard my early years, and I was asked to play with this group of guys that were playing guitars and they were leading worship. Well, I didn't have a concept for what leading worship was, but I quickly became acquainted with that and began doing that. I ended up in this Vineyard church, and I found out, oh man, there's a whole church movement around some of these worship songs that I was doing back in the early 90s. And I was playing on the worship team at this church. I ended up taking up guitar, that's the instrument that I play today and was born to play. But I didn't think leading worship in a home group was worth carrying a keyboard back and forth. So I picked the guitar back up and went for it with that. But, I started doing some things in volunteer leadership, like lay leadership at the church, and got invited to this conference in Augusta, Georgia. It was a regional conference for the Vineyard. And I went to this workshop, and since I was kind of new to the table, none of the topics, because it was for leaders and pastors and stuff, none of the topics really seemed to work for me, except this one workshop, and it was called Wounded by Shame, Healed by Grace. There was just something about that. I thought, I need this. This will probably be interesting. I didn't realize that it was going to be life-changing, because for the first time in my life, with all of the struggles I had had in relationships, my view of God, my view of myself, finally had some language put on it that I was dealing with shame, that I had been exposed to shaming messages. They had become a reality for me. There had been a grid that had formed where even if you paid me a compliment, it would get twisted on its way to me and somehow be an indictment of something. And it was really exhausting to be me. And so having that information was straight up revelation, and putting language on the struggle was like flipping the light on. It's like, oh, okay, I now see what I'm dealing with. Now I can deal with it. And I really dove into that healing journey. And it wasn't like I sat down with somebody and they prayed with me or did some inner healing ministry on me. That particular phase of healing was just so significant and supernatural, because the light came on and then it was a fair fight. I was able to understand who I was fighting and understanding what shame had done to me. And then I was able to work through that. And it took me a while to really come into the identity and understanding who I am in Jesus. It took me a little while to come into that. I was more like just so excited that there was language, and I was reading some books on the subject. Jeff Van Vonderen wrote a book called Tired of Trying to Measure Up, and I devoured that book because it was like totally explaining my whole life and my relationships and stuff. So that was a huge layer of healing, and God unraveled that shame, and then he really introduced me to who I truly was. And just like you were saying in our last episode about coming to understand that I'm his daughter, he wants relationship with me. He loves me as I am. And I really caught that. It was a 3-year journey for me. And I ended up writing a book called Shame on You No More, which was my journey, my story, through the lens of the book Tired of Trying to Measure Up. There were specific things that Jeff Van Vonderen talked about in relationship to shame that I was able to really unfold my story into this book. And it was really amazing that between 2002 and 2005, this journey had completely changed my life. And my relationships were more healthy. I was walking more in my unique calling and not trying to hijack somebody else's because I didn't feel worthy of my own. And it was really a big revelation for me. With the book, I was starting to get some opportunities to minister to some people out of that healing. But I didn't realize that it was only level 1.
And let me just interject something, because there are always levels. But you talked about, you had words for it. You had words for shame. You didn't really know. You didn't have a grid for what was going on. And that's really key with healing, is that when something is brought into the light, that's when it can be healed. Right. That's when it can be dealt with. We know with wounds, if they're kept in the dark, kept covered, not exposed to oxygen and air, they can stay pretty festery, can't they? And so when we say, okay, Lord, I want to allow your light to shine on this, even though it may be painful. It will be more painful and more detrimental if we allow it to stay in the dark.
This is so true.
That was a real key in unlocking your heart and unlocking freedom for you in level 1, as you call it, of healing. Is
first layer.
Jesus going, okay, this is shame. I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to start your healing process.
Right. That's so true. And I'm glad you were highlighting that, because you can't get healing from something that you're hiding. Mm-hmm. And it really was for me, like the light went on. Mm-hmm. It was like, oh my gosh, like I had seen the fruit of the damage in my life, but I did not understand the root of where it came from. And I didn't understand what it was.
And you weren't even necessarily intentionally hiding. You didn't even know.
I was completely
how
ignorant.
many of us are unaware of what's going on, but we're seeing some negative fruit or some bad behavior, and we're like, well, that's a whole other episode. We have to manage the behavior. But it's like sometimes we don't even know that it's there. And again, Jesus in his grace, you were drawn to that workshop, and the Lord was like, okay, we're shining the light on this shame because it's not going to have a hold on you anymore.
That's right. And it was really, it was life-changing for me. It was seriously life-changing for me. It was a game changer all the way through. Mm-hmm. But it was the first half of a 2-part healing that, as I look back on it now, I know that God did that so intentionally with me, because had I gone into phase 2 without phase 1 having happened, mm-hmm. like if I had skipped that piece, I wouldn't be here today. Mm-hmm. I know that. I know that. I didn't realize that there was still some vulnerability. There was some things that God needed to heal in me, and there were some places where I was vulnerable, and I really fell headfirst into a mess with some stupid choices and failure and just all over the place. It was a bad scene. And the result of that was losing my marriage, 16 years of marriage, and my ministry, role in ministry, my church, my everything, my reputation, everything came crashing down. And I knew that the dominoes would keep falling, and they did. And the interesting thing about it was when it all came crashing down, because of layer 1 and understanding my true identity in Jesus, I was able to fall toward the cross and not run from it. And I chose to embrace the healing journey because I wanted everything that God had for me. I knew that although it felt like my life was over, I knew that my failure did not sway God's opinion. Like, I knew that I could not cause him to love me less because I am the object of his love. I don't have anything to do with it other than just being who I am. He loves me because he loves me because he loves me. And so I really did fall into God's grace, and I just wanted to walk this healing journey out. And there's a lot of details in here that another day, another time, but the hardest part for me, and is it's far too common, is that the church really didn't know what to do with me. Even though I was completely broken, I had confessed, I was repentant, I was just absolutely broken. They didn't know what to do with me. Mm-hmm. And often people tend to be uncomfortable with other people's stuff. Classic example, somebody else is grieving. Somebody has lost a loved one, they're grieving. And in the funeral line, when people go through and they're visiting, whatever, people say really stupid things like, well, God needed another angel or whatever. But they do that because they're not comfortable with your pain, and they don't know how to just sit with you in the pain. With brokenness, it's similar, where I'm scared of your brokenness because it's triggering something in me, and so I need to control that, and I need to punish that. If you are familiar with Danny Silk at all, he's written this amazing book called Culture of Honor, and really helps leaders to know how to handle people in their brokenness, people who are messy. I mean, people are messy. We're messy. We have our stuff. But the church didn't know what to do with me. And God very supernaturally placed me in another church. I said a little earlier that if layer 1 hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. The reason I wouldn't have been here is because of the way the church didn't know what to do with me. And I lost my church family. I lost all of my livelihood and my life in that church I had dedicated several years to, 17 years to, 16 years to. And that was the piece that was breaking me. I knew God was okay with me, but the pain I was in and just the people who didn't know what to do with me. And so God really supernaturally moved me from point A to point B, and it took several weeks for that to happen.
And I just want to go back to what I had actually talked about in the last podcast, that he doesn't usually heal us all in one fell swoop because we can't handle it. He's building capacity.
Right.
And as you talked about, that you wouldn't have survived if you had gone through phase 2 before phase 1. Thank God that he took you through that first healing layer, because even though there was a lot more there, he did it step by step.
Right.
And he was building your capacity to be able to receive the deeper healing that he did in this, as you call, phase 2.
Yeah.
And he does that. And I think part of it too is that if he did it all at once, and even if he did do it supernaturally all at once in the snap of a finger, then what kind of journey, what kind of partnership with him do we have? If we've arrived by the age of 32, I've gotten all the healing I need. Where's then my dependency on the Lord?
Right.
Where's my need for him? And it's when we recognize those things in us that it's like, oh, wow, yeah, I haven't arrived. And you're talking about how it, provokes things in people. They're not comfortable with it. And I feel like that too. It's basically, if I come in contact with someone who has the same issues as I do, or that I still need to deal with, it's holding up a mirror to me. And if I'm not willing to go there, I'm going to feel really uncomfortable.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah, absolutely. This whole season, this phase 2 thing was where I really first encountered inner healing prayer ministry, because very early on, after everything hit the fan, my husband then, my ex-husband now, we were sitting in a counselor's office that one of the elders in the church had recommended us to go to for some emergency counseling because of all that was going on. And the message that the counselor wrapped that up with said my ex-husband's name, "You've done nothing wrong, and Cathy, you have no excuse." I mean, that was what she said to us right before we left. And so here I am, absolutely devastated. I desperately want help. And we left that appointment, and I was in the passenger seat, and I was staring a hole in the glove box, trying to figure out a way to take my life. I mean, it was that critical for me. Like, here I am wanting help, and that's what I'm going to get. I can't do this. And literally the whole way home, it was so intense, it scared me. I called a friend of mine who was in California, down in Anaheim, and I said to her, "I don't care about my marriage right now. I will die if I don't get help from me." And that was the thing. I mean, she went to town. She knew of somebody who happened to be in Fort Worth, Texas, who did inner healing prayer ministry, specializing in leaders who fall. His name was John. And I filled out all this paperwork. I got an appointment. I had to wait 6 weeks. Oh,
probably
my gosh.
longest 6 weeks of your life.
Oh my gosh, 6 weeks. But I went to Texas for a week of intensive inner healing, and this man, this godly man, he was in his 70s, and he had ministered the grace and heart of the Father to me, and helped me to work through different things. He even called my home church and said, "Hey, how can I prepare her to come back?" And the response he got was not good for me. And he called me in my hotel room and said, "It's not good. It's not good." And I knew I'd lost my church at that point, but supernaturally, God brought another friend into my hotel room that week who happened to be in Dallas. And she recommended another church in my hometown. And I went there, and it was totally where God wanted me to be. I went forward for prayer at the end of the service, and with this single gal that was up there, and all of a sudden this guy came up. I didn't know who he was. I wasn't in there for the announcement break or whatever, so I didn't see if he was on staff or anything. But he said, we mean business about being a center for healing here. And if God brings you here, I want to know about that because we have resources and we'll walk with you. And it was like, boom, this is home for me. And that man, his name is Terry Cantrell. He's on our pastoral care team to this day. He has been a brother to me through this, and God really used him. But that church in Marietta, Georgia, was at that time just diving headfirst into sozo training, which is one of those modalities, one of the tools. Sozo being a Greek word meaning saved, healed, and delivered. And we're going to be talking to the co-founder of that in our next episode and sharing some of that interview with you. But they were doing basic sozo training and learning, having healing prayer open house to the community. And that church loved me back to life. I received mentoring. I received healthy mothering from the women in the church. I was getting pastoral care. I was in professional counseling. And it was a 2.5-year journey back to life. But I wouldn't trade that for anything. I remember sitting in the counselor's office very early on, and he said to my ex-husband and I, he said, I would not wish your circumstances on anyone, but I wouldn't trade what God is going to do through them for anything. And that became my motto. That was my thing. That's my motto. Yes, I would not ever wish this. This was horrible. It was the worst, darkest night of the soul. You know, St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night of the soul. Man, it was a dark night. But I wouldn't trade what God did through it for anything. But that's like not the last layer, I'm sure. There's more healing. There's more stuff because it is like an onion. But I distinctly remember I was speaking at a conference in Black Mountain, North Carolina, with a ministry I had helped start in Atlanta. I was leading worship for that, been a worship leader since the early 90s, like I was saying. I knew when I was going there to speak and to lead worship that the page was turning, like that season of gut-wrenching healing. Like I was on the other side of that. That was the conference where God introduced you and me. That is where we met at this conference, Unlocking the Heart of the Artist, which was put on by the Worship Studio. Here I had been set off to dream, and Terry Cantrell had asked me to dream, and I had really, my passion was to help other worship leaders not end up in the same mess that I did. And so I had started something on my own. And then God brought you into my life, Melinda, and set us off together. And then the whole vision of that expanded to include, hey, I'm not just about, I'm going to be a little fish in a big pond here, but hey, we're going to join forces and we're going to help the church get healthy because we've walked through that journey and we've seen the difference that it can make. And we have that passion. I mean, that's why we're here today.
Referring back to when I shared in the last episode that I felt the Lord's call on my life to ministry and missions at a very early age. And I have gotten the opportunity to see that manifest in my life over the years, living overseas for many years as a missionary and really fulfilling desires in my heart, or the Lord fulfilling desires in my heart with media and theater and missions and ministry and prayer ministry. And at the time that I met you, Cathy, I was starting my own film company, making documentaries about ministers and missionaries. And the Lord said, when you walked by me at this conference, the Lord said, go introduce yourself to her, offer to make a film. And so my very first documentary film of a minister or ministry was of Cathy Little and her ministry at that point. And the Lord absolutely knit our hearts together. Had no idea I was on my own trying to be a independent filmmaker doing ministry. And we just know that can't really be done alone. And basically ministry, the Bible says two are better than one.
Yeah.
The Lord had really knit our hearts together to minister, and not just as friends, but as ministry partners. Yeah. And I also knew that something had shifted. I was like, oh my gosh, I had been praying in a different direction. Actually, just real quick, for a husband for many, many years. And I said at one point, by the time I got to 39, I said, Lord, if you're not going to bring me a husband, then please bring me a best friend to do life and ministry with. And within 3 months, I had met Cathy, and she's not a consolation prize. It was what the Lord had in mind, because He
created family for
us. He did.
I mean, we are sisters.
He did. We really aren't designed to do life alone. We're created for community. And I'm so thankful that the Lord answered a prayer in a way that was totally out of my thinking. And also, to do a PS to what I shared, is that He continues to give me the honor and privilege to really live out my calling from an early age in all sorts of ways. So it's like, when we recognize who we are in Him, and that we're not orphans, that we're royalty, that He actually wants us to live a joyful life where we're being fulfilled.
Right.
I don't have to dig ditches in Australia.
You mean He doesn't want us to be miserable?
He doesn't want us to be miserable. And so now getting to marry my passion for media and communications and ministry and prayer ministry with my best friend / sister is really a dream come true. Yeah. And it's not without its difficulties and challenges. I'm not saying that, where it's, but
it's not been easy.
It's not at all.
Not always.
But when we're on a path to fulfill our destiny and calling, there certainly is opposition, especially being called to set others free. Of course, the enemy doesn't want this to happen.
He doesn't. And the more pushback we get, the more tenacious we are, because we know that God's on this. I mean, it's been so obvious that God is on this. So absolutely. I mean, He has our yes.
He has our
yes. And the yes that we have given Him is in response to His call to us to get the word out. And so that's what we're doing. And that's what you as our listeners can help us do by liking and sharing and following and rating the podcast, YouTube channel, Instagram. We're on Facebook also. And really, this is not new. This is just a resurgence of what God's always wanted to do. And there's like an acceleration on that for us to be healthy and whole and to walk in freedom. Because Isaiah 63 lists that, bringing healing and setting the captives free and all of that stuff. And it is not just about us being saved for the sweet by and by and being forgiven, although that's awesome. But that's not all
everything.
Of it. That's not all of it. So that's why we keep talking about the full benefits package, because that's what this is, the full benefits package of the cross available to us in the here and now. It's awesome. Cool.
Thank you for sharing your story, Cathy. And I'm sure there will be more to come from you and from me as we progress in our podcast adventure. But we just want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Face to Face Ministries podcast. We are super excited about having you along on the journey and seeing what God wants to do through all this. So thank you again, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
You got it. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. For more information about us and our vision, please go to face2faceministries.org. That's faceministries.org.
Please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Help us get the word out. There is so much more to come.